On the evening of March 20th, 2003, US and British troops swept into Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom had begun. For months they had been poised for action, while the politicians argued whether invading Iraq would be a just war or not.
Iraq is now in further material what terrorists or terrorist states could do with chemical
are working,
biological,
and other means should not be
constitute
allowed.
an axis of evil. It's a danger to the American people, and we got to deal with him.
The invasion was supposedly launched to rid the world of the threat from Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, to fight terrorism, and as an added bonus, to topple a brutal dictator. But as television images of the rapidly escalating conflict were flashed around the world, increasing numbers of people began to question the motives behind the conflict and ask, had war been declared under a cloak of conspiracy to satisfy the US's insatiable craving for oil and protect its mighty dollar?
Bush.
Just 18 days after the invasion, US troops were in Saddam Hussein's capital, Baghdad. It had been a swift and vicious war, and one where President Bush was quick to claim victory. In May 2003, from the safety of his nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, he delivered a mission-accomplished speech to his troops.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
That speech turned out to be a touch over-optimistic. The war was far from over, and the fighting as fierce as ever. This was not the end of the war on terrorism, as had been promised, nor was it the end of hostilities in the Middle East. Back in America, as the US body count rose, some commentators were beginning to get angry. Were the people being told the truth? Behind all those confident, upbeat statements from Bush and his colleagues in the White House, was there a hidden, darker agenda to the whole campaign? If there is a hidden agenda or conspiracy to uncover, then these two cities are where it's at. Unlike anywhere else in America, these are the places where intrigue and scheming run deep.
Go!
New York, the financial heart of America, is home to a growing number of people who think the war was all about money, power, and protecting the wealth and conspicuous consumption of the American lifestyle. In downtown Manhattan, I found one man who thinks he has the answer. In a word, he believes the war was about oil.
We are the largest energy consuming nation in the world. Globally, total demand is about 84 million barrels. We use in this country slightly over 20 million barrels a day. So America is dependent on oil. Unfortunately, almost 60% of the oil that we consume in this country is imported.
But the US was actively seeking further supplies of oil, and its new president, George Bush Sr., started taking more than a passing interest in Iraq.
Iraq is a known oil province. There are no surprises there. Iraq has about 100 million barrels of known proved reserve, with the potential of doubling or tripling that.
So with America after Iraq's oil for decades, perhaps the conspiracy behind the war has its roots back in the 1980s. If it did, then blaming Iraq for 9/11 became a convenient excuse.
Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein. Take one vial, one canister, one crate, slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known.
The other alarming thing from the fall, beyond hearing what the president was saying, these basically lies. The president and vice president told the American people lies.
With the fighting in Iraq as furious as ever, many people are asking, was it a war to rid a country of a dictator, or was it a conspiracy to cover something else? During my travels and research, I've realized that many now believe Saddam Hussein's oil-rich Iraq had long been targeted by America. In 1991, the US, along with the coalition forces of the United Nations, swept into Kuwait to liberate it from the Iraqi invaders. Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil. The US counterclaimed that Iraq caused that war.
Iraqi military and political establishment so that a pro-US government would take the place of Saddam Hussein.
After a short but bloody war, the coalition was at the outskirts of Baghdad. But rather than take out Hussein and occupy the capital, American and UN forces were pulled back at the last minute. For the next 12 years, sanctions were the main weapons the US and its allies used against Iraq. Principal among these sanctions was limiting its oil production, causing financial hardship.
Literally, Iraq was banned from getting just about anything. And as a result, without the ability to conduct trade, during the 90s, Saddam signed several memoranda of agreement with other countries, notably France, Germany, Russia, and other.
Immediately, George W. Bush declared war on terrorism.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
In October 2001, the US invaded Afghanistan in a bid to smash the Taliban and al-Qaeda mastermind Osama bin Laden, who Bush held responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But after months of bitter fighting, bin Laden had still not been captured. So Bush turned his search to an old enemy of his family, Saddam Hussein.
The war on terror involves Saddam Hussein because of al-Qaeda connections, because of his history. He's a danger to the American people. And we got to deal with him. We've got to deal with him before it is too late.
They thought, when September 11th happened, perfect, great opportunity, a great excuse. If we can tell the American people that this is part of the war on terrorism, that this is somehow linked to al-Qaeda, that Saddam has nuclear weapons, then they felt they could actually manipulate the American people, their grief, their suffering, their anger in such a way to carry out something that they had been planning since 1997. And it was a perfect pretext for them, but it had nothing to do with the reality of September 11th and nothing to do with the reality of their own assertions, all of which have proved to be complete lies.
So according to this theory, 9/11 and chasing bin Laden was all a bit of a diversion. But more disturbing to Karen was that this information became American policy and was being broadcast to the world.
Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein.
Seeing those talking points reflected in some cases verbatim in President Bush's speeches and Vice President Cheney's speeches, when we knew, compared to the intelligence, this was very misleading. We knew that this was not right.
Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters, and Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
I had questions about, this seems strange, what's happening, why the rush to war? I don't understand. Intelligence doesn't support it. Why would we be so far advanced in our war planning by the summer of 2002? I mean specific war planning, invasion planning. What's really going on here? Why are we doing this? It's obviously not for the reasons that they're hinting at.
As the countdown to war began, the OSP continued to churn out the alleged misinformation.
From recent intelligence, we know that the Iraqi regime intends to declare and destroy only a portion of its banned al-Samud inventory, and that it has in fact ordered the continued production of the missiles that you see being destroyed.
The other alarming thing from the fall, beyond hearing what the president was saying, these basically lies, did that make me disloyal to Rumsfeld? Did it make me disloyal to Wolfowitz and Doug Feith and Bill Lutey and Dick Cheney and technically George Bush? Yes. Yes, it did. And I to this day will tell you these guys have not upheld the Constitution in any way. They have not preserved the rule of law.
In the same week that Karen left the armed services, George W. Bush's invasion force stormed into Iraq. By defeating Hussein, George Bush Jr. had done better than his dad. It appeared he'd achieved all of his promises. But once the celebrations of victory against this axis of evil country had passed, White House statements about the reasons Iraq was attacked were being forcibly challenged. High on the list were Saddam's supposed weapons of mass destruction. There were hundreds of inspections made before the invasion, and many hundreds after, but not one had produced a single WMD. Perhaps there had been a conspiracy in place to fool the American and British public all the time.
The U.S. knew, and we know that they knew it, that Iraq had no weapon systems, no unconventional, that is biological, chemical, or nuclear.
Before the war, Saddam controlled a country with a quarter of the world's oil production, containing more than 115 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Iraq was swimming in oil. It was a tempting target.
It's not accidental.
As the invasion forces smashed into Iraq, the stage was set for the mayhem that was to follow. All too soon, the oil conspiracy jigsaw was taking shape. By only the second day of the war, US and British troops had already captured Iraqi oil terminals. Some of these were capable of pumping more than 2 million barrels a day. It was the same story throughout Iraq. Oil fields, pipelines, refineries and pumping stations quickly came under US control.
You know, they can insist that oil had...
Nearly all of Iraq's oil fields captured. The US troops had just one more target to complete the conspiracy. On April 8, 2003, barely 18 days after the war had begun, US troops entered Baghdad. For years, the Iraqi people had suffered under a vicious and brutal dictator. In their anger, they turned on their former leader. But while hostile mobs looted hospitals and museums, the US troops turned a blind eye. They had orders to secure and hold other objectives.
Interesting that the first thing that they closed and other things to be looted, which really didn't go down well. They didn't win the hearts and minds of the people.
By invading Iraq, Bush had seized all of its oil fields. Once they've been updated, production will increase to 3 million barrels a day, twice the 2002 levels. Some estimate that the final production will rise to 6 million barrels a day and threaten to undermine all other oil producers. With the Iraq War supposedly over and battle raging against insurgents and terrorists, accusations and conspiracy theories were hurled against the Bush administration. Throughout them all, the seizing of Iraq's oil was at the top of the list, even though the US and UK continued to deny it. But the price that the US is paying for its newfound black gold is reaching massive proportions. Even so, George Bush and his administration seem as confident as ever that it's a war worth fighting. After years of struggling under crippling sanctions, Saddam Hussein decided to use the one WMD that no one had ever looked for or even thought about. With the Iraqi oil industry firmly under US control, there was just one final task left to do to complete the conspiracy and save the dollar.